Good evening, and welcome back. If you are joining us for the first time, how lovely that you found your way here. And if you have been with us before, well, you already know what kind of evening lies ahead. Tonight, we step away from the quiet villages and garden parties for something a little darker, a little more gilded. A world where the chandeliers shine too brightly, where the champagne is always cold, and where the smiles, oh, the smiles never quite reach the eyes. Tonight's story is called Poirot and the Silken Web of Treachery, a murder in high society. A web spun so carefully, so delicately, that at first glance it looks almost beautiful. But Hercule Poirot, our little Belgian detective, he sees what others do not. He always does. The question is, can you spot the thread before he pulls it? Settle in, get comfortable. The story begins now. The house on Eaton Square. The fog had come in early that October evening, wrapping itself around the lampposts of Eaton Square like a grey shawl pulled tight against the cold. London in autumn had a particular quality to it, a kind of theatrical melancholy, as though the city itself knew that something was about to go wrong and had dressed accordingly. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of his flat on Whitehaven Mansions, looking out at nothing in particular. He had been standing there for some minutes. His coffee had gone cold. He had not noticed. He was tired. Not the tiresome tired of a man who has not slept. He had slept perfectly well, thank you. But the deeper, quieter tired of a man who has seen too much of human nature and finds it, on occasion, rather disappointing. He was 63 years old. His feet ached when the weather turned damp, and the weather, lately, had been very damp indeed. He turned from the window, regarded his cold coffee with mild reproach, and rang for Georges. It was at precisely this moment, as it so often is in these matters, that the telephone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Chief Inspector Japp, and it had that particular quality Poirot had come to recognize over the years. Not alarm, exactly. Japp was not a man easily alarmed, but there was something clipped about it, something pressed thin, like a letter folded one too many times. Poirot, we've got a body. Eaton Square, number 44. Lady Henrietta Voss, found by her lady's maid not an hour ago. I know it's late, and I know it's damp out, but I'd consider it a personal kindness if you'd come. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Lady Voss, he repeated. The wife of Sir Edmund Voss, the financier. The very same, and it is suspicious, this death. There was a pause on the line. When Japp spoke again, his voice had dropped half a register. Poirot, the woman was found at the bottom of her own staircase, dressed for dinner, full jewels, not a hair out of place, and there were 14 people in the house at the time. 14. Not one of them heard a thing. Poirot reached for his coat. Number 44 Eaton Square was the kind of house that announced itself without trying. 4 stories of white stucco, iron railings painted glossy black, a fanlight above the door that cast a warm amber glow onto the wet pavement below. Even now, with 2 police constables standing on the front steps and a third keeping back a small cluster of curious neighbours, the house maintained a certain dignity, as though scandal, like bad weather, was something that happened to other addresses. Poirot paused on the pavement and looked up at it. Behind him, a taxi splashed away into the fog. His shoes were already damp. He made a small sound of displeasure and mounted the steps. Inside, the house was warm and very still, the particular stillness that descends upon a place after something terrible has happened, when everyone present is performing calmness for one another's benefit and not quite succeeding. The entrance hall was magnificent, black and white marble floor, a staircase of pale stone curving upward to the right, its brass handrail polished to a mirror finish. Hothouse flowers, white lilies heavy-headed, in a tall Chinese vase on the console table. Their scent was overwhelming. Poirot found it, in the circumstances, rather oppressive. At the foot of the staircase, some 8 steps from the bottom, a woman lay. She was on her back. Her evening gown, deep green silk, the colour of a shadowed garden, had spread around her in a way that was almost composed, almost. Her right arm was extended, fingers slightly curled. Her left was folded beneath her. She wore diamonds at her throat and in her ears. Her face was turned slightly to one side, and in the lamplight she looked very young and very still. She had been, Poirot judged, somewhere between 45 and 50. A handsome woman, the kind of woman who would have filled a room simply by entering it. He stood for a moment at a respectful distance, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at her with great attention and great quietness. Japp appeared from the drawing-room doorway, a notebook already in hand. "Glad you came. Doctor's been. Preliminary thoughts are a broken neck from the fall, but he's not happy about it. Something's off, he says, though he can't pin it down yet. We'll know more after the post-mortem." "The 14 guests," Poirot said. "Where are they now?" "Drawing-room. All of them. Sir Edmund's with them. He's—" Japp paused, choosing his word carefully. "He's holding together, just about." "And the lady's maid?" "The one who found her. Small sitting room, second floor. Name's Elsie Marsh. Been with Lady Voss 7 years. She's in quite a state, as you'd expect." Poirot nodded slowly. He was still looking at the body. "The dinner," he said. "It was a private dinner? A party of some kind?" "Annual thing, apparently. Lady Voss hosted it every October. Same guest list, more or less, year after year. Old friends of the family. A few business associates of Sir Edmund's. 14 sat down to dinner at 7:30. By 9 o'clock, Lady Voss was dead. And no one," Poirot said quietly, "heard anything. Not a soul." He spoke to the guests first, briefly and in groups, simply to observe. It was a habit of his. This first general survey, like walking around a painting before examining it closely. The drawing-room was long and elegantly furnished, its walls hung with pale blue silk that had faded gracefully over the years. Someone had lit the fire, which was kind, and the room smelled of wood smoke and expensive perfume. 14 people arranged themselves about it in various attitudes of distress and control. Poirot stood near the doorway for a moment and let his eyes move quietly from face to face. There was Sir Edmund Voss himself, a large, heavy-set man of perhaps 60, with a broad, florid face that had gone rather grey this evening. He sat in a wing-back chair near the fire, one hand over his eyes, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him. He had the look of a man who had received a blow he had not seen coming and had not yet quite processed whether to be devastated or furious. Beside him, not quite touching him, but near, sat Mrs. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington, a slender woman in her mid-50s, fine-boned and pale, with silver-blonde hair and the composed expression of someone who has trained themselves, over many years, to reveal very little. She was watching Sir Edmund with careful eyes. When she noticed Poirot noticing her, she looked away. Across the room, near the far window, stood Mr. Oliver Stanhope, tall, fair, perhaps 35, with the easy posture of a man accustomed to being the most attractive person in the room. He was staring at the floor. His champagne glass was still in his hand, though he appeared to have forgotten it entirely. Not far from him, sharing a small settee with the rigid politeness of people who did not particularly like each other, sat the Fenwick sisters. Miss Clara Fenwick, sharp-faced and sharp-eyed, perhaps 60, and Miss Ruth Fenwick, younger by a decade, softer in face if not obviously in character. There were others. A Colonel somebody, 2 couples Poirot did not recognize, a young woman who had been crying and had given up trying to hide it, an older gentleman with a hearing aid who seemed mildly confused about events. But it was these 5 that Poirot's eye returned to, not because they had done anything, simply because of the way they were arranged in the room, the angles of their attention, the things they were carefully not looking at. Interesting, thought Poirot, and said nothing. He found Elsie Marsh in the upstairs sitting room, as Japp had said. She was a woman of about 40, compact and neat, with red-rimmed eyes and hands that would not quite stay still in her lap. A constable stood discreetly by the door. On the table beside her, an untouched cup of tea had gone cold. Poirot sat across from her, and regarded her with the mild, unhurried expression that people often found, to their surprise, easier to talk to than they had expected. "You have had a very great shock, Mademoiselle Marsh," he said. "I will not keep you long, but I must ask, what time did you find Lady Voss?" 8:53. The precision of it, the instinctive precision, told Poirot something. She was a woman who noted details. Good. "I know because I looked at the clock in the hall as I came down. I always note the time. Lady Voss, she liked things recorded properly. You were coming downstairs for what purpose?" "Lady Voss had asked me to bring her evening shawl down to the dining room. She felt the cold terribly this time of year. I had it over my arm." She stopped, swallowed. "I saw her at the foot of the stairs. I thought at first she had fainted. I called out to her. And then I saw her eyes." A silence. "She was already dead," Poirot said gently. Elsie Marsh nodded. "Once. Very tightly." "Tell me," Poirot said after a moment, "in the days before this evening, had Lady Voss seemed different to you in any way? Worried, perhaps? Distracted?" The maid's hands stilled in her lap. It was a small thing, barely a pause. But Poirot noticed it. She had been a little tired, Elsie said. The preparations for the dinner always wore her out. "Of course," said Poirot pleasantly. "Of course." He thanked her and rose to leave. At the door, he stopped, as though something had just occurred to him. "One small thing, mademoiselle. Lady Voss, the shawl you were bringing her. Was it something she had asked for during dinner? A message sent up to you, perhaps?" "Yes, one of the footmen brought word." "Which footman?" A slight frown. "Thomas, the younger one." "And the message, was it written or spoken?" "Spoken. He said Lady Voss asked for her blue shawl." "The blue shawl," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Not the cream one she usually wore in the evenings?" Elsie Marsh stared at him. "How did you know about the cream one?" Poirot smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, the kind that gave very little away. "I didn't," he said, "until now. Good night, Mademoiselle Marsh. Try, if you can, to sleep." He stood alone in the corridor for a moment, after he left her, his hand resting lightly on the banister. From below, the faint murmur of voices. Above, the house was very quiet. The fog pressed against the corridor window, thick and pale. Poirot looked down the length of the hallway, at the closed doors, the careful arrangements of furniture, the small framed watercolors on the walls, all of it speaking of a life organized with great deliberateness, great attention to presentation. Someone in this house, he thought, had spun a very careful web. The silk was still warm. What the doctor found. The post-mortem report reached Japp by 11 o'clock the following morning. Poirot was already at Eaton Square when it arrived. He had, in fact, been there since 9:30, sitting in the small breakfast room off the main hall with a cup of tea he had requested and a biscuit he had not touched, going through the guest list with the quiet, methodical patience of a man arranging flowers. Each name in its proper place, each relation to the others noted, each small fact filed away behind those remarkable grey eyes. He heard Japp's step in the corridor. Quick, purposeful, slightly heavier on the left foot than the right, an old injury from the war that Japp never mentioned, and looked up before the door opened. Japp came in without ceremony and dropped the report on the table between them. "She didn't fall," he said. Poirot looked at the report. He did not pick it up immediately. "Tell me," he said. Japp pulled out a chair, turned it around, and sat on it backwards, in the way that had always faintly irritated Poirot, and which Japp had therefore never stopped doing. "Dr. Hennessy. Good man, thorough. He found bruising on the upper arms, both of them, consistent with someone having gripped her, hard, from behind." He tapped the report with one finger. "The neck was broken, yes, and the fall would account for that. But the fall itself was not an accident, and it was not, as we might have supposed, a matter of her losing her footing on the stair. She was pushed," Poirot said. "She was pushed, and held, first, by someone standing close behind her on the stairs. Someone who knew what they were doing, or at the very least," he paused, "someone who did not hesitate." Poirot was quiet for a moment. Outside the breakfast-room window, the rear garden of number 44 showed grey and damp in the October morning light. a stone bench, a rose bed, the last blooms gone over, an ornamental pond, its surface perfectly still. The bruising, Poirot said. The size of the hands. Can Hennessy say anything? He can say they were not small, not a child's hands, not a very slight woman's. Beyond that, not yet. And the timing. He is satisfied that death occurred between 8:45 and 9 o'clock, which puts it squarely in the middle of dinner. Japp's expression shifted, something between professional admiration and grim discomfort. 14 people sitting down to lamb cutlets in the dining room, Poirot. Footmen serving, candles lit, and someone slipped away from that table, went to that staircase, and... He stopped, and returned, Poirot said softly, without anyone noticing they had gone. The dining room at number 44 was long and formal, papered in deep red above dark oak panelling. A table that could seat 20 had been laid for 15, Lady Voss's place at one end, Sir Edmund's at the other, 13 guests arranged between them. Poirot walked the length of it slowly, his hands behind his back. The places had not yet been cleared. The police had seen to that. The table remained as it had been. Half-finished plates, crystal glasses with the dregs of wine still in them, a centerpiece of late dahlias beginning to droop. The candles in their silver holders had been extinguished, but the wax had run and set in pale rivers down their sides. He stopped at Lady Voss's chair. Her napkin was still on the seat, unfolded, set aside, not replaced. She had left in the middle of the meal, or, a small correction, she had been absent at some point during the meal, and her napkin had not been tidied because no one expected her to return so soon. Poirot stood very still and thought about this. He moved then to the chair directly to Lady Voss's left. According to the seating plan Japp had obtained from the butler, a precise, anxious man called Hayward, who clearly felt that a murder on his watch reflected poorly upon his entire career. This seat had been occupied by Mr. Oliver Stanhope. He looked at the plate. The food had been eaten with appetite, or at least, the food was largely gone. He moved around the table to the chair 3 places to Lady Voss's right, Mrs. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington. The food on this plate was less touched. The wineglass was empty. He crouched, a movement that cost him slightly more than it once had, and he was aware of this, and slightly irritated by it, and looked beneath the table. Nothing of note. He straightened, put one hand briefly on the back of the chair to assist himself, and hoped no one had seen. No one had. The room was empty. He stood for a moment, eyes moving along the table, and then he walked to the far end and looked back. From here, from Sir Edmund's chair, you could see the full length of the table, every face, every empty place. He wondered if Sir Edmund had noticed anything. He wondered if Sir Edmund had chosen not to. Sir Edmund Voss received him in the library. He was a big man, as Poirot had noted the previous evening, and he seemed somehow larger in the daylight. Not taller, but denser, more present, the way large men sometimes do when the social niceties of evening dress are replaced by the blunter reality of a grey morning and a dead wife. He had not slept, this was clear. There were shadows beneath his eyes that had not been there the night before, and his collar, usually so perfectly aligned, sat slightly crooked at the neck. He did not appear to notice. "Monsieur Poirot," he gestured to a chair. He did not sit himself. He went to the window instead, and stood, with his back partially to the room, which was, Poirot thought, either grief or calculation, possibly both. "I understand, there is now a formal investigation." "That is correct, Sir Edmund. I am sorry for the circumstances." A short silence. The man's shoulders rose and fell once, heavily. She was found on the stairs," he said. "I have been telling myself, all night, I have been telling myself, that it may have been, that she may have simply—" He stopped, turned around. His face was doing several things at once, and not all of them were grief. "Is it true what they're saying, that it was not an accident?" "I am afraid," Poirot said carefully, "that it does appear that Lady Voss's death was not accidental." Sir Edmund looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk and sat down in the leather chair behind it. a motion that was almost mechanical, as though his body were executing an old habit while his mind was somewhere else entirely. "Who?" he said. The word came out flat and strange, stripped of everything. "That is what we are here to discover. Sir Edmund, I must ask you some questions that may be uncomfortable. I ask them not to distress you, but because the answers matter." The man nodded. "Once. Your wife, in the weeks before this evening, was there anything she said to you, anything that troubled her or that suggested she was worried?" Sir Edmund's jaw tightened. Henrietta was. She did not confide in me easily. She was a private woman, self-contained. A beat. We had been married 22 years. Poirot noted the way that sentence ended. Not we were very close, or I would have known. Simply, 22 years. A duration. Not a description, the guest list for this dinner, Poirot continued. It was, I understand, much the same each year. Old friends, associates. Yes. All of them known to you personally. All of them. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. Most of them for many years. "Oliver Stanhope," Poirot said, in the same conversational tone. "How long have you known him?" The pause was perhaps half a second too long. 4 years. He was introduced to us by the Fenwicks. He was, a friend of Henrietta's. They shared an interest in the opera. He sat beside her at dinner. He usually did. And then, as if aware of something in his own voice, Henrietta arranged the seating. "Naturally," Poirot said. "And Mrs. Marsh-Pennington? She is an old friend. Of Henrietta's, from before our marriage. I barely know the woman. She attended the dinner every year." "Every year, without exception." Poirot nodded pleasantly, as though all of this were perfectly unremarkable, and moved on. He asked about the footman Thomas next, carefully, without emphasis. Sir Edmund knew little about him. He had been engaged 8 months ago. Hayward had hired him. Reliable, as far as he knew. Then Poirot asked, as though it were an afterthought, "The message sent to Elsie Marsh during dinner, asking for Lady Voss's blue shawl. Did Lady Voss mention to you that she was cold, that she intended to send for it?" Sir Edmund frowned. "No, she didn't." "You are certain?" "She sat at the far end of the table." We did not speak much during dinner. But no, she said nothing of a shawl." Poirot rose and thanked him warmly. At the door, he paused. "One small thing. The seating arrangement. You said Lady Voss organized it herself. Did she make any changes to it this year? Anything different from previous years?" Sir Edmund thought about it. "Now that you ask, yes. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington. She usually sits mid-table. This year, Henrietta moved her to the right side, closer to—" He stopped. "Closer to," Poirot prompted gently. "Closer to Oliver Stanhope." Poirot smiled. "Thank you, Sir Edmund. That is most helpful." He found Japp in the hallway, speaking to the younger of the 2 footmen, Thomas, a fair-haired young man of perhaps 22, who had the careful eyes of someone who knew he was in trouble and was not certain how much. Poirot waited until Japp had finished, and then approached Thomas himself. "The message," he said, without preamble. "The message you carried to Elsie Marsh during dinner, asking for the blue shawl. Who gave you that instruction?" Thomas's careful eyes became more careful still. "Lady Voss, sir. She called me to her chair between courses and asked me to go up and tell Marsh to bring her shawl." "Which shawl, specifically?" "The blue one, sir. She was particular about it." "She said blue." "Yes, sir. And this was—" "When, exactly?" "Between the fish and the meat, sir. 8:30, perhaps. Perhaps a little before." Poirot looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, but with the particular quality of attention that made most people feel, correctly, that lying was not a productive option. "Thomas," he said, "think very carefully. Is there anything about that moment, anything at all, that struck you as unusual? Her manner, her expression, the way she spoke to you?" The young footman was quiet for a long moment. Then, "When she looked frightened, sir." Poirot went very still. "Frightened," he repeated quietly. "I told myself it was nothing, that I'd imagined it. But—" Thomas stopped, swallowed. Her hand was shaking when she reached for her wineglass after. I saw it shake. Poirot thanked him and stepped back. He stood alone for a moment in the black and white marble hallway, beneath the white lilies that still smelled of funerals, and thought. Lady Voss had been frightened. At 8:30, she had been alive and frightened. She had sent for her maid, not for her husband. Not for any of the guests, for her maid. Why? What had she wanted to say? What had she seen, or heard, or understood, in the moments between sitting down to dinner and sending that message upstairs? And who, in that long candle-lit room, had seen her send it, and understood that time, suddenly, was very short? First threads. The morning after a murder has a quality unlike any other morning. Poirot had noticed this many times over the years. The way the world continues its ordinary business with what seems, to those caught inside the tragedy, a kind of indecency. Milk was still delivered. Post arrived. Somewhere down Eaton Square, a motorcar horn sounded twice, impatiently, and a dog barked in response. Inside number 44, the house had settled into a kind of suspended state. The guests who lived in London had been permitted to return to their own homes the previous evening, after their names and addresses had been carefully recorded. Those who had travelled from further afield, the Fenwick sisters from Wiltshire, Colonel Aubrey Brace from somewhere in Shropshire, and Oliver Stanhope, who had given an address in Chelsea, but mentioned, with slightly unnecessary detail, that he had recently been staying in the country, had been asked, with great politeness and the firmness that underlies great politeness, to remain available. Poirot had arranged to speak to them individually today. He had also, before leaving Whitehaven Mansions that morning, sat for 20 minutes at his writing desk and done something that looked, to the uninformed observer, like nothing at all. He had simply sat, hands folded, eyes on the middle distance, thinking. He had a system, and the system was this. Before speaking to anyone, he arranged what he already knew into its proper shape. The facts on one side, the impressions on the other, and in the middle, the space between them, the questions. The facts, so far, were these. Lady Henrietta Voss, aged 48, had been murdered on the staircase of her own home between 8:45 and 9 o'clock on the evening of the 14th of October. She had been seized from behind, held, and pushed. The bruising indicated a person of some physical confidence, not necessarily strength, but decisiveness. She had not struggled significantly, which suggested either that the attack was very swift, or that she had not, at the crucial moment, been able to. She had been frightened at dinner. She had sent for her maid, not for help, or not obviously for help, but the action now seemed to Poirot less like a request for a shawl and more like something else, an attempt to get a message out, a reaching toward someone trusted. The maid had not arrived in time. The message, whatever it was, had died with Lady Voss at the foot of the stairs. On the impression side, Sir Edmund Voss was a man with a great deal of control over his exterior and considerably less certainty beneath it. He had not asked, as grieving husbands sometimes do, compulsively and repeatedly, who would do this, as though the question itself were a comfort. He had asked once, flatly, and then he had stopped asking. Mrs. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington had watched Sir Edmund with eyes that were careful in a way that went beyond concern. There was a particular quality to the attention of a woman watching a man she knows very well, and it is quite different from the attention of a woman watching a man she barely knows. Poirot had observed this distinction for many years. He was quite certain of it. Oliver Stanhope had stared at the floor of the drawing-room the previous evening with the expression of a man who was not so much grieving as recalculating. And Elsie Marsh, loyal, precise Elsie Marsh, had paused when asked whether Lady Voss had seemed different in the days before her death. It was a very small pause. But small pauses, in Poirot's experience, were where the truth lived. In the middle, the questions. Why the blue shawl and not the cream one? Who had moved Mrs. Marsh-Pennington's seat closer to Oliver Stanhope, and why? And what had Lady Voss seen or heard at that dinner table, between the fish course and the meat, that had made her hand shake? He spoke to Miss Clara Fenwick first. She was waiting for him in the morning room, a small, bright room at the back of the house overlooking the garden, and she was already seated when he arrived, back straight, hands folded on the handle of her handbag, wearing an expression of composed irritation that suggested she had been composed and irritated for most of her 60 years and had no intention of changing now. Monsieur Poirot. She did not offer her hand. I have already spoken to that inspector of yours at considerable length. I was hoping we might not have to go through it all again. I shall endeavour to be brief, Miss Fenwick, Poirot said pleasantly, settling himself across from her, and to ask only the things Inspector Japp has not already asked. Something in her expression shifted, not quite approval, but its preliminary stage. Very well. You have known Lady Voss for many years, since she was Henrietta Calder. Before she married Edmund, we came out the same season. She paused. That was a very long time ago. You were close friends. We were good friends. There is a difference. She said it without apology. Henrietta was not. She was not an easy woman to be close to. She kept things, held them to herself. You might know her for 30 years and still find, occasionally, that there were rooms in her you had never been invited into. Poirot found this description, so precise, so unsentimental, rather striking. In recent months, he said, had you noticed any change in her? Clara Fenwick was quiet for a moment, and in that moment her composure did something interesting. It didn't crack exactly, but it became less of a performance and more of an effort. She was worried about something, she said at last. I noticed it in August, when we were all at the Braces' place in Shropshire for the weekend. She was distracted. She made a remark at dinner that she then immediately covered over, you know the way one does, with a laugh and a change of subject. But I had heard it. What did she say? Clara Fenwick looked at him steadily. She said, and I am certain of this, I have been thinking about it since last night. She said, one can only carry a secret for so long before it begins to carry you. The room was very quiet. And no one asked her what she meant. I asked her. Afterward, privately, she said it was nothing. A line from something she'd been reading. Miss Fenwick's jaw tightened slightly. It was not a line from something she'd been reading. No, Poirot agreed. I think not. He thanked her and rose. At the door, he turned. Miss Fenwick, Oliver Stanhope. You introduced him to the Vosses, I understand. How did you come to know him? For the first time, something flickered in Clara Fenwick's eyes that was not composure. He was introduced to me, she said carefully, by Dorothea Marsh-Pennington. Ruth Fenwick was a different matter entirely. Where her sister was contained, Ruth was merely quiet, a softer, less armoured quiet, the quiet of a woman who had spent a lifetime slightly in the shadow of someone more forceful and had come, not unhappily, to inhabit that shadow. She cried a little at the beginning of the interview, dabbed at her eyes with a small handkerchief, and apologized for it. Not at all, Poirot said kindly. It is the natural response. Clara thinks crying is self-indulgent, Ruth confided. But I think sometimes one must simply… She stopped and dabbed again. She was kind to me, you know, Henrietta, quietly kind. In the way of someone who doesn't want it noticed. She sounds, Poirot said, with genuine feeling, like a woman of considerable character. Oh yes. Ruth folded her handkerchief. Though she made a great mistake, Poirot waited. Ruth looked at her hands. She seemed to be deciding something. Then, with the air of someone stepping off a curb into traffic and hoping for the best, she trusted the wrong people. I don't know. I can't say. I don't have proof of anything, Monsieur Poirot, and I wouldn't want you to think… I think nothing yet, Poirot said. Tell me what you observed. Oliver Stanhope, Ruth said. He came to the Vosses' circle through Dorothea, which was odd, because Dorothea and Henrietta were old friends, very old friends, but there was always something underneath it, something not quite. She pressed her lips together. I always felt, when I watched them together, that they were playing a game whose rules I didn't quite understand. And when Mr. Stanhope appeared, the game seemed to change, become more serious. In what way? He paid attention to Henrietta, a great deal of attention. And she was not a vain woman, Monsieur Poirot. but she was not immune to it either. No woman is, entirely, when the attention is offered so artfully. Ruth paused. But lately I had begun to think that the attention had a purpose, that it was not, that he did not. She couldn't finish the sentence. Poirot finished it for her, silently, in his own mind, that the attention was not genuine. That Oliver Stanhope, with his easy posture and his carefully aimed charm, had been cultivating Lady Voss for reasons that had nothing to do with affection. "Miss Fenwick," he said gently, "did Lady Voss ever confide in you about Mr. Stanhope, about the nature of their friendship?" Ruth looked up. Her eyes were clear now, the tears gone. "Once," she said, "about 2 months ago, she telephoned me very late in the evening, quite out of character. She rarely telephoned, she preferred to write, and she said—" Ruth paused, remembering it precisely. "Ruth, I think I have been very foolish. I think I have allowed someone to use me as a stepping stone, and I have only just looked down and seen it." The air in the morning room was very still. "What did you say?" Poirot asked. "I asked her what she meant, what she wanted to do about it." Ruth's voice dropped. "She said she hadn't decided yet. She said she needed to think." A long pause. "That was the last time we spoke properly. The last real conversation." He found Japp in the hallway after, and drew him aside. "The footman Thomas," Poirot said quietly. "I want to know everything about him. Where he came from, who gave him his reference, who recommended him to Hayward. Everything." Japp looked at him. "You think he's involved? I think he carried a message during dinner, and I think it is worth knowing who told him what to say." Poirot paused. "And I want, if you can arrange it, to speak with Mrs. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington this afternoon, alone." "Without warning?" Japp raised his eyebrows. "Without warning?" "Particularly without warning," Poirot said. He took his lunch alone in a small café 2 streets from Eaton Square, at a corner table with his back to the wall, an old habit, and a sensible one. He ate a bowl of soup that was acceptable, and a piece of bread that was not, and thought about silk. The thing about a web spun from silk, he reflected, was that it was nearly invisible until the light caught it at precisely the right angle. Then, suddenly, every thread was clear, every junction, every calculated placement. Lady Voss had been a stepping stone. Ruth Fenwick's word, or rather, Lady Voss's own word, reported faithfully by Ruth. A stepping stone, toward what? Toward Sir Edmund's money? His business connections? Something else? And Dorothea Marsh-Pennington, who had introduced Oliver Stanhope into this circle, who had been moved to sit beside him at this particular dinner, who watched Sir Edmund with those careful, knowing eyes. Where did she sit in this web? At its edge, or closer to its centre? Poirot drank the last of his soup and set down the spoon with a small, decisive click. "One thread at a time," he told himself. "One thread at a time." He reached for his coat and winced very slightly as his shoulder protested. An old complaint, made worse by damp weather. He ignored it with the practiced ease of long acquaintance and stood. Outside, the fog had thinned a little. The October afternoon light fell thin and grey over the wet pavements. Somewhere in this city, a woman named Dorothea Marsh-Pennington was going about her afternoon without knowing that Hercule Poirot was, at this moment, walking in her direction. He straightened his hat. He walked. Secrets and lies. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington lived in a flat in Knightsbridge, the kind of address that communicates, without stating, that one has always had just enough and has always known precisely how to arrange it to look like considerably more. The building was quiet, well maintained, its brass letterboxes polished to a shine. The lift was the old-fashioned kind, with a folding iron gate that closed with a sound like a firm decision. Poirot rode it to the 3rd floor and stood for a moment in the corridor before ringing the bell. He could hear, faintly, movement inside, then stillness, then, after a pause that was perhaps 2 seconds longer than it should have been, the sound of the latch. She had looked through the peephole first. He had expected that. The door opened. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington was dressed as though she had been expecting company. or as though she were the kind of woman who was always dressed as though expecting company, which amounted to the same thing. A wool dress in a grey-blue that suited her colouring. Her silver-blonde hair set and pinned. A single strand of pearls. She was, Poirot thought, a woman who understood the armour of appearance, and wore it with long practice. What she had not quite managed to arrange, on short notice, was her expression. It was composed. But it was the composition of a woman who has just had a few seconds to compose herself, and no more. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was warm and steady. "What a surprise! Do come in." The flat was elegant in the way of a stage set. Everything in its place, nothing superfluous. A kind of curated calm that Poirot associated with people who thought very carefully about how they wished to be perceived. Pale walls, good furniture, not new, watercolours, originals, he noted, not prints. A bureau in the corner, its roll-top closed. Fresh flowers on the mantelpiece, white and yellow, not lilies. Someone who knew that lilies had funereal associations and had chosen accordingly. She offered tea. He accepted. She went to the kitchen to make it herself, which told him the daily woman was not in today, and he used the 4 minutes of her absence to look, quietly, without touching anything, at the room. The bureau interested him. It was closed, but not locked. The small brass key was in the lock, turned but not fully secured, in the way of someone who had closed it in a hurry and had not quite completed the action. On the mantelpiece, beside the flowers, a framed photograph. A group of people on what appeared to be a lawn. A summer gathering of some kind, informal, sun-bright. Poirot studied it without picking it up. Lady Voss was in it. Younger, perhaps 5 years ago. She was laughing at something off camera. Beside her, arm not quite touching hers but angled toward her in the particular way of a man who wishes to appear casual about where he is standing, was Oliver Stanhope. And on Lady Voss's other side, watching not the camera but Lady Voss herself, with an expression that was not quite warmth and not quite its opposite, Dorothea Marsh-Pennington. Poirot straightened as he heard the sound of the tray being lifted. She came back with the tea arranged beautifully on a small silver tray. The kind of beautiful arrangement that takes perhaps 30 seconds if one is very practiced at it. She set it on the low table and sat across from him with the ease of a woman entirely at home, which she was, and entirely comfortable, which she was not. "You will forgive the intrusion," Poirot said pleasantly. "I have only a few questions, and then I will leave you in peace." "Not at all." She poured the tea with a steady hand. "I want to help in any way I can. Henrietta was—" She paused, and the pause was very well done. She was a dear friend. "This is an enormous shock." "Of course," said Poirot. "Of course." He accepted his cup. He did not drink from it immediately. "You have known Lady Voss for a very long time," he said. "Since we were girls, almost. We met at 20. We have been friends, were friends, for over 30 years. She looked at her own cup. One doesn't quite believe at first that someone so present can simply be gone. "It is very hard," Poirot agreed. "Mrs. Marsh-Pennington, I want to ask you about Oliver Stanhope." Not a flicker, not the smallest movement in her face. "Of course," she said. "What would you like to know? How did you come to know him?" "We met at an auction. Sotheby's. Oh, 3 or 4 years ago. We found ourselves bidding on the same lot. A small landscape. 18th century. He won it." A slight, practiced smile. "We had coffee afterward. He was charming company." "And you introduced him to Lady Voss?" "Eventually, yes. He expressed an interest in meeting the Vosses. He knew of Sir Edmund through business circles. Edmund is rather well known in certain financial quarters, and I arranged an introduction. It seemed natural." "He knew of Sir Edmund," Poirot repeated. "Through business, yes. And yet it was Lady Voss with whom he became particularly friendly. Henrietta was very easy to like." The answer came smoothly, immediately. Perhaps a fraction too immediately. Poirot set down his cup. "Mrs. Marsh-Pennington," he said, and something in his tone shifted. Not harshness, nothing as blunt as that, but a quality of directness that had not been there before. I am going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully before you respond. She looked at him. For the first time, a small uncertainty moved behind her eyes. Lady Voss told a mutual friend, approximately 2 months ago, that she felt she had been used as a stepping stone, that she had allowed someone to use her, and had only recently understood this. He paused. She was frightened at dinner, on the night she died. She sent for her maid, not, I think, for a shawl, but to pass some kind of message or warning. She did not have time to do so. Another pause. Her hand was shaking. The room was very quiet. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington looked at him with eyes that had gone very still. I am telling you this, Poirot continued gently, because I believe you know things that are relevant to Lady Voss's death. I believe you have known them for some time, and I believe, and here I may be wrong, I acknowledge this, that whatever part you have played in this matter, you did not intend for Henrietta Voss to die. The silence stretched out between them, like a wire pulled too tight. Then, something happened to Dorothea Marsh-Pennington's face. It was not dramatic. There were no tears, no sudden collapse of composure. It was subtler than that, a kind of settling, as though a weight she had been holding at arm's length for a very long time had simply become too heavy, and she had decided, quietly, to set it down. She looked at her hands in her lap. No, she said at last, very quietly. I did not intend for her to die. She talked for a long time. Poirot listened without interrupting, which was, he had always found, the most productive thing one could do when someone had finally decided to speak. Interruptions gave people the opportunity to reconsider. Silence did not. The story she told was not, in its broad outline, a surprising one. It was, in fact, a very old story, old as greed, old as the particular human tendency to convince oneself that a small wrong is not really wrong if the eventual aim is justified. Oliver Stanhope was not what he appeared. She had not known this at first, or rather, she had not let herself know it, which was a different thing but a common one. He had met her, as she had said, at Sotheby's. He had been charming. He had paid her the kind of attentive, intelligent attention that was, for a woman of 55, living alone on a carefully managed income, not easy to dismiss. They had become, she chose her words carefully here, close friends. It was only gradually that the shape of what he wanted had become apparent to her. He was interested in Sir Edmund Voss, in Sir Edmund's financial dealings specifically. There were, she pressed her lips together, there were certain investment structures that Sir Edmund had developed over the years, certain arrangements, not strictly illegal, but not strictly transparent. Oliver Stanhope had known about them. He had known about them before he ever walked into that auction room. He used you, Poirot said, quietly, not as an accusation. To get to Henrietta, she said. Yes. A pause. Henrietta had access to Edmund's private correspondence, his study, his files. Not because she pried, she was not that kind of woman, but because they were there, in the house, and Edmund had never bothered to lock them away from her. He did not think she would be interested. He did not think, a slight tightening around her mouth. Edmund has always rather underestimated women. And Stanhope wanted access to this information. He wanted leverage, Dorothea said. The word came out flat and clear. He was building a case against Edmund, something he could use, for blackmail or to sell to a competitor. I was never entirely sure which. He needed documentation. He needed someone inside the household who could get it for him, and he cultivated Lady Voss for that purpose. He cultivated me first, and she stopped, looked at the window. When she turned back, her eyes were very direct. I told him certain things about Edmund's affairs. Things I had heard over the years at dinners, in passing, the way one does accumulate information without quite meaning to. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself Edmund was not, that he was not a good man in business, that he had not always been honest, and that therefore, that the wrong done to him was justified, Poirot said. Yes, the word was barely audible. And Lady Voss, when did she become involved? I don't know exactly when Oliver turned his attention from me to her. I noticed it perhaps 8 months ago, the way he spoke about her, the questions he began asking, and I understood. She folded her hands very tightly in her lap. I understood that I had introduced him into her life, that whatever he was doing, I had made it possible. I had opened the door. Did you warn her? A long pause. I tried to, twice. Both times I could not find the words that did not also incriminate me. She looked at him steadily. I am not proud of that. And Lady Voss, do you think she had discovered what Stanhope was really after? I think she had. Dorothea's voice was very quiet now. I think, looking back at the last 2 months, I think she had discovered something specific, something concrete. I think she found it, and I think she didn't know what to do with it, because it implicated not just Oliver but… She stopped. Poirot waited. But also me, she finished. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Outside, a motorcar passed on the wet street below. Mrs. Marsh-Pennington, Poirot said carefully, on the night of the dinner, where were you between 8:45 and 9 o'clock? She had been expecting this question. She had been expecting it, he thought, since she opened the door and found him standing in the corridor. At the table, she said. I did not leave the dining room during dinner. You are certain. I am certain. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching. Whether that was innocence or very good nerve, he could not yet say. One more thing, he said, rising. The seating arrangement. Lady Voss moved you this year, placed you beside Oliver Stanhope at the table. Do you know why? Something moved across Dorothea's face. Something that was almost, Poirot thought, fear. I assumed, she said slowly, that she wanted to watch us, together, to see how we behaved with each other. A pause, to confirm what she suspected, that you and Stanhope were connected. Yes, Poirot nodded slowly. He picked up his hat from the side table. You have been very honest with me this afternoon, he said. More honest, I think, than you intended to be when you opened the door. She said nothing. I would ask you, he continued, not to speak to Oliver Stanhope before I have had the opportunity to speak to him myself, not to warn him, not to telephone or write. Her chin lifted slightly. And if I choose not to agree to that, Poirot smiled. It was a very small smile. Then I would be forced to conclude, he said pleasantly, that your honesty this afternoon was rather more selective than I had given you credit for. A pause. I won't contact him, she said. He was on the pavement outside the building, turning up his collar against the October chill, when he stopped. He stood quite still on the wet pavement for a moment, a thought arriving with the particular quiet certainty of a thought that has been working its way to the surface for some time and has finally broken through. Lady Voss had moved Dorothea Marsh-Pennington's seat specifically to watch her and Stanhope together, which meant Lady Voss had gone into that dinner already knowing, or strongly suspecting, the connection between them, which meant she had not been frightened by something she had heard or seen during dinner itself. She had been frightened before she sat down. Whatever had tipped her toward action, toward the desperate act of sending for her maid, of reaching for Elsie Marsh across the distance of a staircase and a household, that thing had happened before the dinner began. Poirot stood in the damp October air and revised, quietly and completely, his understanding of the evening's timeline. Something had happened before dinner. He needed to know what, and there was, he thought, exactly one person left in this house who might know. He turned and walked back toward Eaton Square. Elsie Marsh was going to have to tell him what she had been holding back. The silken trap. Elsie Marsh was packing. Not frantically, not with the disordered urgency of someone fleeing, but with the quiet, methodical efficiency of a woman who had been a lady's maid for 20 years and knew how to fold a blouse so that it did not crease, even when her hands were not entirely steady. Poirot stood in the doorway of the small upstairs room and watched her for a moment before she heard him. When she turned and saw him, she did not startle. She simply stopped, set down the folded garment in her hands. It was a cream shawl, he noticed, not blue, and stood very still. Mademoiselle Marsh, Poirot said gently, I think it is time, do you not? She sat on the edge of the narrow bed. He took the small chair by the window. Outside, the October afternoon was fading already, the light going thin and copper-colored over the rooftops. "In an hour it would be dark. You were going to leave," Poirot said. It was not an accusation. "Sir Edmund has no further need of me," Elsie said. Her voice was composed but effortful, like a door held shut against wind. "My position here is finished." It seemed sensible to begin arrangements. "Of course." Poirot folded his hands in his lap. "Before you arrived, before you found Lady Voss at the foot of the stairs, you had spoken with her. That afternoon, before the guests arrived. It was not a question." Elsie looked at him. Her eyes were dry now, had been dry since the first interview, the tears used up, leaving behind something harder and quieter. "Yes," she said. "She told you something." "Yes. And you have not told Inspector Japp, or anyone else, what she told you, because," he paused, chose his words carefully, "because she asked you not to. Because Lady Voss was a woman who valued her privacy above almost everything, and even in fear, even knowing what she knew, she could not quite bring herself to abandon that habit." Elsie Marsh looked at her hands. "She made me promise," she said quietly. She was not the sort of woman you broke a promise to, Monsieur Poirot." "Even now, I understand that," Poirot said, and he meant it. "But I think Lady Voss made you promise in the expectation that she would deal with the matter herself. That evening, at dinner, she did not anticipate that she would not be alive by 9 o'clock." A long silence. Then Elsie Marsh looked up, and something in her face shifted. The last lock of a door that had been holding against considerable pressure. "She found letters," she said. They had been in Oliver Stanhope's coat pocket. Not discovered by intent. Lady Voss was not, as Dorothea Marsh-Pennington had said, the kind of woman who pried. But Stanhope had arrived early that afternoon, before the other guests, and had asked, with his usual easy manner, to leave his overcoat in the small study rather than with the other coats in the hall. He had some papers in the pocket, he said. He didn't want them muddled. Lady Voss had shown him to the study herself. Stanhope had been called away briefly. Hayward had come to the door with some question about the evening's arrangements, and in those few minutes, alone in the room with his coat across the back of the chair, Lady Voss had seen the corner of an envelope protruding from the pocket. "She said she didn't intend to look," Elsie said. "She said the envelope was already open, already half out, and she saw her own name on it. Not the outside, the letter itself. She could see her own name written in the text. She pulled it out," Poirot said. "She pulled it out, and she read it." "What did it say?" Elsie was quiet for a moment. "She didn't tell me everything. She was very controlled, even then. She told me the essentials." A breath. "It was a letter from Mr. Stanhope to someone she didn't know, a name she didn't recognize. It described how he had gained her confidence, how he had used her access to Sir Edmund's household to obtain copies of certain financial documents. It referred to her." Elsie stopped, swallowed, continued. "It referred to her as the instrument. That was the word, the instrument, as though she were not a person but a tool he had picked up and used, and was now—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Poirot sat with this for a moment in silence. Lady Voss, proud, private, self-contained Lady Voss, had stood alone in her own study and read a letter that described her as an instrument, a means to an end, a door through which Oliver Stanhope had walked, used, and intended to walk back out of without a backward glance. He thought of what Ruth Fenwick had told him. "I think I have allowed someone to use me as a stepping stone, and I have only just looked down and seen it." She had suspected it for months, but suspicion and confirmation are different countries, and the distance between them, when you finally cross it, can be devastating. "She replaced the letter," Poirot said. "Yes, exactly as she had found it. She didn't want him to know she had seen it." "Not yet." Elsie's voice was very even now, the evenness of someone recounting something terrible with great precision, because precision is the only way to get through it. "She came upstairs to me. She sat down, right where you're sitting, Monsieur Poirot, and she told me what she had found. And she said she needed to think about how to handle it. She was going to confront him. At dinner, she said she had decided to watch him first, watch him and Mrs. Marsh-Pennington together. She was certain there was a connection there. And then, afterward, when the other guests had gone, she was going to speak to him directly. Alone. Elsie pressed her lips together. I told her to call the police. She said she would not yet. She said she needed to understand the full shape of it first, and she could not do that if she called the police before dinner. And the message during dinner, the shawl. I was wrong about that, Elsie said. She told me, before dinner, she told me that if she sent for the shawl during the evening, I was to take it as a signal, that something had changed, that she had decided she needed to speak to me before confronting him. She looked at Poirot steadily. The blue shawl was the signal, not the cream one. She chose blue because it was not a shawl she ever asked for in the evenings. She said it would be unmistakable. Poirot was very still. The blue shawl. Not a request for warmth. A signal. A woman who was frightened and trying to reach the one person in that house she trusted, across the elaborate structure of a formal dinner, through the only means available to her. She saw something at dinner, Poirot said slowly. Something that made her change her plan. Something that made her send the signal earlier than she had intended. I don't know what, Elsie said. I only know she sent it. At what time had you agreed she might send for the shawl? If she needed to. She said, if she needed me, she would send before the meat course. Elsie's voice was barely above a murmur now. Thomas came to me during the fish, earlier than planned. Poirot stood. He moved to the window and looked out at the fading afternoon, not because there was anything to see, but because he needed a moment in which to think. She had sent the signal early. Something at that table, in the first course of dinner, had frightened her enough to accelerate everything, to abandon the careful plan of watching and waiting and confronting him afterward. What had she seen? He turned back. Mademoiselle Marsh. When Lady Voss came upstairs to you that afternoon, when she told you what she had found in the letter, did she say anything else? Anything about the other person named in the letter, the recipient? Elsie frowned slightly, thinking. She said she didn't recognize the name, a man's name. She said it meant nothing to her. A pause. But she said there was something in the letter about a meeting, arranged for that week. She said she thought the letter had been brought to the dinner, deliberately, that evening, to be passed. The room seemed to contract slightly around Poirot. Passed. At the dinner. The letter, or the information it contained, was to be handed to someone that evening. Someone who was in that dining room. Not Oliver Stanhope acting alone. Oliver Stanhope acting as the delivery mechanism for something that was to change hands that very night. Across a candle-lit table, beneath the noses of 14 people eating lamb cutlets and discussing nothing in particular. Lady Voss had understood this. And she had understood, sitting at that table, watching Stanhope, watching Dorothea Marsh-Pennington, watching the faces of the people she had known for years, that she had to move, that she could not wait until after dinner, that whatever was going to happen during it. She had sent for Elsie. And someone had realized she had sent for Elsie. And someone had understood, with the cold precision of a person who has been very careful for a very long time and has no intention of being unraveled now, that Lady Voss had to be stopped before Elsie Marsh came downstairs. Poirot stood very quietly in the small upstairs room and felt the web shift around him, all its threads suddenly visible, suddenly taut, the light catching each one at exactly the right angle. Mademoiselle Marsh, he said, I need you to think very carefully. The letter Lady Voss found, she described the recipient, the person Stanhope was writing to. She said the name meant nothing to her, but can you remember, what did she say the name was? Elsie was quiet for a long moment. She only mentioned it once, she said slowly. I almost didn't register it at the time. She was so focused on what the letter said, not who it was to. Please, Poirot said quietly. Think. The clock on the small mantelpiece ticked. Elsie Marsh looked at the wall. Her eyes went slightly distant, the way eyes do when a person is not looking at what is in front of them, but at something further back. A room, an afternoon, a woman sitting in that chair and speaking in a low, controlled voice about something that had shaken her to her foundations. "Brace," Elsie said at last. I believe she said Brace. The name landed in the quiet room, like a stone into still water. Poirot did not move. Colonel Aubrey Brace, from Shropshire, at whose house the weekend party had been held in August, where Clara Fenwick had heard Lady Voss say that a secret could only be carried so long before it began to carry you. The man with the hearing aid who had seemed, in the drawing-room the previous evening, mildly confused about events. Who had seemed confused? Who had, now that Poirot considered it with fresh eyes, never once looked confused in any way that mattered? "Thank you," Poirot said. His voice was very calm. It was the particular calm of a man who has just watched the last piece of a puzzle settle into its place and is taking a moment to appreciate the completed picture before he acts upon it. He found Japp at the Yard an hour later, and he told him everything. Not in the dramatic fashion that some might have preferred. Poirot had never had much patience for unnecessary theatrics, but clearly, sequentially, with the quiet efficiency of a man who has done his thinking and is now simply communicating the results. Japp listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Japp, and a measure of how seriously he was taking it. When Poirot finished, Japp sat for a moment. "Brace," he said. "Colonel Aubrey Brace, the dithery old boy with the hearing aid." "The man," Poirot said precisely, "who wishes to appear to be a dithery old boy with a hearing aid." Japp rubbed his face with both hands. "Right." Stanhope gathered the information from Lady Voss through her access to Sir Edmund's files, and Brace is the buyer, or the blackmailer, or both. The letter was to be passed at the dinner, discreetly. These things can be done very discreetly. A folded note beneath a bread plate, an envelope slipped inside a jacket during the general movement of guests toward the drawing-room. Lady Voss understood this, and she understood that if the exchange happened, the evidence was gone, so she had to act before dinner ended. Before the end of dinner, yes. And Stanhope, Poirot paused. Stanhope saw her send the message to Elsie Marsh. He understood what it meant. He knew she had found the letter, or he suspected it. He knew that the maid coming downstairs meant Lady Voss had found an ally, a witness, someone to whom she had told what she knew. So he moved first. He excused himself from the table, Poirot said, quietly. Between courses, when movement is natural, when a brief absence is unremarkable. He went to the staircase. He waited. A pause. He did not have to wait long. She came to the staircase herself. She was, perhaps, coming to intercept Elsie before she reached the dining room, to give her further instructions. Or simply, perhaps, she heard something in the hall and went to look. Japp was quiet for a moment. "Can we place him off that table?" he said. "Any witness who noticed him gone." "That," Poirot said, "is what we need to establish tomorrow. And I think, when you speak to the other guests individually, quietly, and ask them to think very carefully about the movements at that table during the fish course, I think you will find that someone noticed. Someone always notices. They simply did not understand, at the time, that it mattered." Japp nodded slowly. He reached for his jacket. "And Brace?" Poirot stood. "Brace did not kill anyone, but Brace is the reason the killing happened. He is the thread that, when pulled, will unravel everything." He picked up his hat. I would suggest you speak to him first thing in the morning, before he has the opportunity to consult with anyone, before the web has time to repair itself." He moved to the door. His knee ached, the left one, always the left in cold weather, and he was tired in a way that went beyond the tiredness of a long day. It was the tiredness that came at the end of a case, when the worst of it was confirmed, and what remained was only the necessary and unpleasant work of proof. "Poirot," Japp said, as he reached the door. He turned. "Good work," Japp said, simply and directly, in the way that Japp, on rare occasions, could be. Poirot nodded once. He did not smile. "It is not finished yet," he said. The final confrontation. The morning of the 16th of October arrived clear and cold, the first genuinely clear day since the fog had come in, and London looked, in the thin autumn sunlight, as though it had been washed and set out to dry. The pavements gleamed. The trees in the square had turned overnight to bronze and ochre, and the light coming through them fell in broken, shifting patterns on the wet ground below. It was, Poirot thought, arriving at Eaton Square at 9:30. Entirely the wrong kind of morning for what was about to happen. A confrontation of this nature deserved grey skies. It deserved the fog, not this fragile, clear-eyed light that made everything look as though it could be seen plainly and understood. Very little about this case, he reflected, had been plain. Japp had moved early. By 8 o'clock, Colonel Aubrey Brace had been collected from his club in Pall Mall, quietly, with the minimum of fuss that the yard extended to men of a certain age and address, and was now sitting in an interview room on the Embankment, where he had, according to Japp's brief telephone call, immediately requested a solicitor, and then, when told one was on his way, had begun to talk without waiting for him. Frightened men, in Poirot's experience, talked. It was the composed ones who remained silent. Oliver Stanhope had been located at his flat in Chelsea at 7:15 that morning. He had not talked. He had said nothing at all, in fact. Had stood in his doorway in his dressing gown with the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for this knock, and had decided, some time ago, exactly how he would receive it. He was now also at the yard, in a different room from Brace, with a solicitor who had arrived rather more promptly. Sir Edmund Voss had been informed of developments. He had received the information in his library, in his wing-back chair, with a glass of brandy he did not drink, and had said nothing for a very long time. And now Poirot was here, because there was one final conversation that had to happen, and it could not happen at the yard, and it could not be conducted by Japp. He found them both in the morning room, the same room where he had spoken to the Fenwick sisters 2 days before. They had not been asked to be there together. They had arrived separately and independently, and had found each other already present, and had, apparently, been sitting in silence for some minutes before Poirot arrived. Clara Fenwick sat in the chair nearest the door, back straight as always, hands on her handbag. Ruth Fenwick sat across from her on the small settee, her hands in her lap, her eyes on the window. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington sat apart from them both, near the fireplace, which had not been lit this morning. She was very pale. She had not slept, he thought. Or if she had slept, it had not been restful. Poirot closed the door behind him and stood for a moment, looking at the 3 women. 3 women who had known Henrietta Voss, in different ways, at different depths, across different spans of years. 3 women who were each, in their separate fashion, responsible for a portion of what had happened in this house 3 nights ago. Not equally responsible. That was the essential distinction, and Poirot was not a man who muddled his distinctions, but not entirely innocent either. Not one of them. He sat down. "I am not going to lecture you," he said. "I am not going to tell you what you should or should not have done, or when you should have done it. That is not my purpose here this morning." He looked at each of them in turn. "My purpose is to tell you the complete shape of what happened, because Lady Voss deserves to have the complete shape of it known, by the people who knew her, before it becomes the business of courts and newspapers and all the cold machinery that follows a thing like this." No one spoke. He began. "He told it from the beginning, the real beginning, which was not the evening of the 14th, but rather a morning at Sotheby's auction rooms some 3.5 years ago, when a man named Oliver Stanhope had sat down beside Dorothea Marsh-Pennington over coffee and begun, with great patience and great care, to spin a web. He told it without sparing Dorothea. She sat through this with her eyes on her hands, very still, and did not look up. Stanhope's target had always been Sir Edmund. Specifically, Sir Edmund's financial arrangements, a series of investment structures built over 15 years that were, at the generous end of the assessment, ethically questionable, and at the less generous end, The kind of thing that certain parties would pay considerable sums to obtain documentation of. Sir Edmund had built his fortune in the years after the war with the particular ruthlessness of a man who had survived enough to feel entitled to whatever came next, and had not always been careful about the methods. Brace was the connection to those parties. He had served with men who now moved in circles where such documentation had value, not for blackmail necessarily, though that was one application, but for competitive advantage in the world of post-war finance, where information was as much a currency as money itself. Brace had been recruited, carefully, over time, as the receiver, the man who would take the documentation and pass it along to those who had commissioned it. Stanhope had needed an inside connection. Dorothea had provided it, first with information gathered over years of dinners and conversation, then with the introduction to Lady Voss, who lived in the house where the documentation was kept. He had cultivated Lady Voss for months, not clumsily, never clumsily. He was a patient man with a considerable talent for making women feel genuinely seen and valued, and he had deployed this talent with the cold calculation of a craftsman who feels nothing for his material. Lady Voss had trusted him, and then, gradually, she had begun to doubt. And then, in the study that afternoon, she had found the letter, and the doubt had become certainty. She was going to expose him, Clara Fenwick said. Her voice was flat and hard. That evening, that was her plan. Yes, Poirot said. She was going to watch them at dinner, confirm the connection between Stanhope and Mrs. Marsh-Pennington, and then confront Stanhope privately afterward, before he could pass the letter to Brace. He paused. But something changed during the dinner. What? Ruth asked softly. She watched them, Poirot said. Stanhope and Mrs. Marsh-Pennington seated beside each other at her deliberate arrangement, and she saw, during the fish course, something pass between them. Not the letter itself, that was intended for Brace, and Brace sat at the other end of the table, but a signal of some kind. A look, a gesture, the briefest communication between two people who have established a private language. And she understood. He stopped. She understood that whatever was to happen was going to happen before dinner ended, that she had less time than she had thought, and so she sent for Elsie Marsh. The morning room was very quiet. Stanhope noticed her send the message, Poirot continued. He had been watching her all evening. He would have been watching her very carefully, because he was a careful man, and because some part of him, I think, had begun to suspect that she knew something. Perhaps it was the seating arrangement. Seeing himself placed beside Dorothea, he would have understood that this was deliberate and wondered why. He folded his hands. When she summoned her maid, he knew. He understood that the evening was about to unravel, and he made a decision. He said this last sentence very quietly and without inflection, because this was the part that required no elaboration. This was the part that was simply what it was. He left the table between courses. He went to the staircase, and he waited for Lady Voss, who had, in the last minutes, decided to go to the staircase herself. Perhaps to intercept Elsie before she reached the dining room, perhaps because she heard movement in the hall. He paused. She came to the staircase, and he was there, and he did not hesitate. Ruth Fenwick had her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Clara Fenwick was looking at the wall. Dorothea Marsh-Pennington was looking at Poirot, and her face had the expression of a woman who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has now been told, definitively, that she can put it down, but finds that she cannot quite do so, and perhaps never entirely will. He returned to the table, Poirot said. Within minutes. He sat down, and he ate his dinner, and he talked to the people on either side of him, and he waited for the sound of discovery, which came, as you know, at 8:53, when Elsie Marsh found her mistress at the foot of the stairs. A long silence. "Brace," Clara said at last. "The Colonel." He received nothing that evening. The exchange never happened. He is now speaking to the police at considerable length, which is, in my experience, what happens to men who are not, at their core, made of the same material as the men they do business with. "And Stanhope?" Ruth asked. "Is saying nothing. He is intelligent enough to know that silence is his best instrument now, as charm was his best instrument before. Poirot's voice remained even. It will not be sufficient. There is the doctor's report. There is testimony from Elsie Marsh. There is the letter, which Lady Voss replaced in his pocket, and which the police have now recovered. He paused. And there is the testimony of another dinner guest who will, I believe, confirm that Stanhope was absent from the table during the fish course. A Mrs. Hartley Cunliffe, seated 2 places from him, who noticed the empty chair and thought nothing of it at the time. She will think rather more of it now. He stood. The 3 women did not move. He looked at Dorothea Marsh-Pennington. "You will be required to give a full statement," he said. "Everything you told me. And more besides. It will not be comfortable. There may be consequences. The nature of them depends on things I cannot predict." He let a moment pass. "But you will tell the truth. All of it." Dorothea met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "I will." It was a very simple answer, and she gave it without hesitation, and Poirot thought that it was perhaps the first entirely uncomplicated true thing she had said in a very long time. He spoke to Elsie Marsh briefly in the hallway before he left. She had not, he noticed, resumed packing. The small room upstairs was as he had left it, the folded cream shawl still on the bed, the half-filled trunk open against the wall. "What will you do?" he asked her. She considered the question with the thoughtfulness she brought to everything. "I don't know yet," she said. "I shall have to find a new position." "But not yet, I think. Sir Edmund will need someone to manage the household for a while, someone who knows how things are done here." She paused. "It is what Lady Voss would have wanted seen to." Poirot nodded. "She was fortunate," he said, "to have had you." Elsie looked at him steadily. "She should have called the police that afternoon," she said. "I told her so." "Yes, she was too. She wanted to manage it herself. She always wanted to manage things herself." Something moved in Elsie's expression. Grief, exasperation, tenderness, all of them at once, and inseparable from each other. "That was Henrietta." "That was Henrietta," Poirot agreed quietly. He thanked her and put on his hat. Japp was on the front steps, collar up against the October air, a cigarette in hand that he was not quite smoking. "Brace has given us the names," he said without preamble. "The parties who commissioned the documentation. It goes rather further than we thought. There are 3 names, 2 of them in the city, 1 of them in the Lords, and my superintendent is already speaking to his superintendent, and I suspect this will become somebody else's very large problem before the end of the week." "As it should," Poirot said. "Stanhope's solicitor made noises this morning about the evidence being circumstantial." Japp drew on the cigarette finally, let the smoke out slowly. "I told him about Mrs. Hartley Cunliffe. He made rather fewer noises after that." Poirot descended the steps. He stood for a moment on the pavement, looking up at number 44, the white stucco, the black railings, the amber fanlight above the door, all of it exactly as it had been when he first arrived, 4 nights ago, in the fog. The house looked the same. Houses always did. "Japp," he said. "The footman, Thomas, checked him this morning. His reference was written by a man connected to Brace, a former army colleague. He was placed here 8 months ago deliberately, to facilitate access and communication." Japp's mouth tightened. "He's 19 years old. Came up from Wiltshire. I don't think he understood half of what he was involved in." "No," Poirot said. "I did not think so either." He looked at the house a moment longer. Then he turned and walked along the pavement, his hands in his pockets, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. The bronze and ochre leaves had begun to fall in the slight breeze, 1 or 2 drifting down through the thin sunlight, settling on the wet ground. He thought of Lady Voss, standing in her own study with a letter in her hand, reading the word instrument, and understanding, in that moment, the precise and merciless calculation with which she had been used. He thought of her at the dinner table, frightened, her hand shaking on the wineglass, watching Stanhope and Dorothea from the far end of the room, and understanding that she had to move, and move now, and reaching, through the only channel available to her, a young footman and a message about a shawl. for the one person she trusted. He thought of her on the staircase. He thought about the silk. The most dangerous webs, he reflected, were indeed those spun with the finest thread, because the finest thread was nearly invisible, because it did not feel, to the person caught in it, like a trap. It felt, for a long time, like simply the texture of ordinary life. A charming man at an auction, an old friend who arranged an introduction, a dinner every October, the same guests, the same house, the same candlelight, and beneath it all, patient, deliberate, perfectly positioned, the spider. He reached the corner of Eaton Square and paused. His feet ached. His left knee ached. He was tired in a way that a night's sleep would help but not entirely cure. He thought, briefly, of his cold flat in Whitehaven Mansions, of George and hot coffee, and the particular quiet of an evening with nothing required of him. He thought that tomorrow he would take no cases. He thought this, it must be said, with the awareness of a man who has thought it many times before and has never once managed it. He raised his hand for a taxi. One came almost immediately, a small Mercy, on a cold morning, and he climbed in, gave his address, and sat back against the seat as the cab pulled out into the traffic of the square. Outside the window, number 44 Eaton Square receded. The black railings, the white stucco, the amber light. The web was torn, the silk lay in pieces, and Hercule Poirot, tired and aching and not yet finished with the world, went home.